Hello everybody, my name is Zen and welcome back to more of our player guides where in the previous videos we talked about some of the beginner things that you would have to go through like the business model and character creation, but we're going to start moving into more advanced concepts such as the different classes available in the game. As a reminder, this is a beginner guide. There may be some information you can glean from this if you're an experienced player, but if you're not, then these guides probably aren't for you and you'll have to wait for our intermediates to come out. But until then, let's start talking about the different classes available in SWTOR because it gets very complicated very quickly. So there are 8 classes total. There are 4 on the Republic and 4 on the Empire. On the Republic you have the Trooper, the Smuggler, the Jedi Consular, and the Jedi-knight. On the Empire you have the Bounty Hunter, the Agent, the Sith Inquisitor, and the Sith Warrior. Now, if you take a moment to look at that, you can probably notice a structure, which is that you have 2 non-Force using classes and 2 Force using classes on each of the factions, and they set that up purposefully. Now, what you have to understand, though, is that each of these classes mirror each other on the different factions, so the Trooper and the Bounty Hunter are essentially the same class. They have the same class mechanics, very similar abilities, they're just renamed, reskinned, and then the talent trees are very much the same, just once again renamed and reskinned. That doesn't mean that they are, the exact same class. They do have their own little quirks here and there that make them feel different. A lot of it is gear, sound effects, the way the guns work for the Trooper as opposed to the Bounty Hunter. It changes things up a little bit, but for the most part everything is mirrored. And the Smuggler is a mirror of the Agent, the Inquisitor is a mirror of the Consular, and the Knight is a mirror of the Warrior. But once you take those 8 classes into account, then you gotta think about the concept of advanced classes, which is something that Star Wars has. It's something that you unlock at level 10. You get it with your skill tree. In fact, it's how you unlock your skill tree. And with each class, you have 2 choices of an advanced class. And we'll talk about that in a second. But with each class having 2 choices, that technically takes the 8 classes to 16. But if you wanted to think of them as 4 classes because they're mirrored, then you have 8 classes. So either way, it works. I mean, it's not too complicated when you get into the nitty-gritty of it. It's just one of those things that you have a lot to learn to begin with, and once you learn what all the different advanced classes and classes can do, then you can kind of get an understanding and a grasp of the class concept in Star Wars altogether. So let's get into the advanced classes a little bit. Let's talk about when you get it, because I mentioned that you get it at level 10, but technically you get it at level 10-ish, It's not you hit level 10 and suddenly you can get your advanced class. It's one of those things that you get it once you've completed the main story for the first planet that you start on. So say you're a Sith Warrior, you start on Korriban. Once you finish that planet and go to the fleet, you can then get your advanced class, or you can get it on Drubinkos, which is the next planet, but it's just more convenient to get it on the fleet since you're there. There'll usually be a guy to talk to, and he will send you over to your trainer, and then you can choose your advanced class that way. As a reminder, you can only choose your advanced class once. You can't unchoose it, so make sure that you're choosing what you actually want to play. Hopefully, though, you've already figured that out, especially if you watched our character creation guide, where you can kind of go into a story of a character and figure that out for yourself. However, a playstyle is slightly different than what your story could possibly revolve around, and my suggestion is just to play one of everything and kind of figure out what you like the most. However, before we can actually break down each individual advanced class telling you what it does, we got to discuss a topic that is pretty essential to most RPGs, but is incredibly essential in MMORPGs, which is the idea of the quote-unquote Holy Trinity. It's what they call it, which is tank, heals, and DPS. What that means is a tank is a guy who, as a player, his job is to get the attention of all the creatures when you're in a group of players. If you do that, then you have another class that is typically a healer, and that healer, his job is to keep everybody alive, especially the tank who's taking all of the damage, hopefully, if he's doing his job. And then the DPS, that stands for damage per second. DPS is basically a guy whose job is to kill everything. So you have these 3 roles, and they're essential in Star Wars. I mean, heck, even your companions that you get during your story quests have these 3 roles, so it's something that's incredibly essential that you need to know about. And if it is one of those things that you turn out that you're like, I really like doing damage, or I really like tanking, or I really like healing, then I would suggest trying to learn those roles more dramatically and trying to figure out what their purpose is even more so, because it is very important to know your role inside and out. Personally, I like tanking, so I really like kind of being in the thick of it, taking all the damage, and I've based my skill set around that. But for you, I would suggest playing one of everything, as I said earlier. Once you kind of figure out what you want to play, you can kind of go from there, figure out what role you want to fill in a group setting after that. Now let's talk about the individual advanced classes for each of the classes. Now you have to remember and keep in mind in the back of your head, each of these has the option for DPS, so I'm not even going to mention it. I'm just going to kind of mention how they typically play and what roles they have available to them outside of just DPS. So let's start with the Trooper. The Trooper has the Commando and the Vanguard. The Commando is more of a ranged character, fights from afar, and has the option to heal. The Vanguard is more upfront, likes to be in the melee, likes to be in the thick of it, and it has the option to tank. You have the Smuggler that has the Gunslinger, another ranged character. However, it can only DPS, it has no option to do anything otherwise. And then you have the Scoundrel that is more melee, and then it has the option to heal. Then you have the Consulars, Sage and Shadow. The Sage is ranged and has options for healing. The Shadow is melee and has options for tanking. And lastly, for the Republic, you have the Knight, which is the Sentinel and the Guardian. Sentinel can only melee DPS, there's no other option for him, but the Guardian can melee DPS and tank. As for the Empire, you have the mirrored classes here. So the Bounty Hunter has the Mercenary and the Power Tech. The Mercenary is a ranged character who has the option to heal. The Power Tech is a melee that has the option of tanking. The Agent has the Sniper and Operative. The Sniper is only ranged DPS, can't do anything else. Operative is melee and has the option to heal. The Inquisitor has the Sorcerer and the Assassin. The Sorcerer can do ranged and has the option to heal. The Assassin is melee and has the option of tanking. The Warrior has the Marauder and the Juggernaut. The Marauder is only melee DPS, just like the Sentinel for the Knight, and the Juggernaut has melee DPS and can tank. Now, at first glance, a lot of you would look at this and be like, well, I would like to play a class that has the option to do something other than just DPS. So most of you guys wouldn't just choose Sniper or Marauder or Sentinel or Gunslinger because they don't really have any other options there. So you couldn't really try out any of the other roles if you wanted to with those. So usually people go with something like the Assassin, the Operative, the Scoundrel, the Vanguard, things like that, which I completely understand, but don't frown upon the Sniper or the Gunslinger, because both those classes are great fun to play. Even if you were interested in tanking, I would suggest trying those out because they are just a lot of fun, and maybe you would be like, maybe I like DPS more, and maybe that's the thing for you. Also, you want to kind of keep in mind with your playstyle, if you're not comfortable being in a leadership position, then being a tank might not be for you. Typically, the tank is a leader of a group. It determines when people are pulling. It determines where you guys are going, because it's usually the thing doing most of the work when it comes to grabbing the different creatures within a dungeon or a raid. But let's move on to one of the last points for this class guide, which is the armor classification for each of these different classes, because some of the advanced classes wear different armor than their counterparts. And what I mean by that is, let's say the Warrior, right? The Warrior has a Marauder and the Juggernaut, but they both wear different types of armor, and you need to kind of know which one does what. So in Star Wars, you have 3 main armor classifications. You have light, medium, and heavy, which is pretty typical for any MMO such as this, but what you need to know is kind of where the stats fall. So with light armor, you really only see willpower on it, and willpower is a stat used by the Inquisitor and by the Consular, so they're typically the ones using the light armor. Even their tank counterparts, like the Assassin or the Shadow, uses light armor, and they have a buff that makes it so they take a little less damage than they would if they were just wearing light armor, which isn't very good. You then have medium armor, which can have the stats of either strength or cunning, typically. So with that, you have the agent and the smuggler only wearing medium armor. They can't wear anything else. But then you have the knight and the warrior, the marauder and the sentinel, which are the pretty much melee DPS focused advanced classes of those two main classes, can wear medium armor and can only wear medium armor, but they focus on the strength attribute there, obviously, rather than the cunning, which is what the smuggler and the agent wear. And lastly, you have your heavy armor, which can either have aim or strength on it. So obviously the bounty hunter and the trooper are going to be wearing the aim gear with the heavy armor, and the juggernaut advanced class of the warrior and the guardian advanced class of the knight are going to be wearing the heavy armor with strength on it. And while all of that was a brief rundown on how gear kind of works, we'll have a much more in-depth guide for gear later on, because it does get complicated when you start getting into custom mods and stuff like that. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry, you'll hear about it in a few videos. So let's get into the last part of the class guide, which are resources. And resources are a mechanic within the game that every class has. It basically allows them to use their abilities. Now, what resources each individual class has varies based on what class that you're actually playing, and even what mirrored class you're playing. Now let's talk about the first resource, which is heat, and the bounty hunter uses heat. Now what is heat? Well, it is an empty bar at first, but when the bounty hunters cast anything, it generates heat, and that bar fills up. As it fills up, the fuller it gets, the slower it takes to degenerate, and it's one of those things that just kind of dissipates over time. So you want to make sure that as you're using your abilities, you're not going over more than a quarter of your heat, because it's going to take longer and longer and longer to recharge itself, which is really bad. So it's kind of a balance mechanic. You have to not use too much, or in certain situations know when to use enough, and then use certain abilities that get rid of your heat very quickly. However, the mirror class, the trooper, uses ammo, which works exactly the same, except it's an opposite bar, which means it's always full, and as the trooper uses abilities, it degenerates, right? So you lose more and more ammo, but it constantly is regenerating. Same thing, you don't want to have less than 3/4 of your bar there, otherwise it's going to take longer and longer for it to regenerate itself. In the individual class guides, we'll be talking more about how these resources work and how to manage them. However, I'm just giving you a rundown of kind of what they are to begin with here. Next up, though, is Force, and Force is something that the Consular and the Inquisitors use. It's basically a full bar, there's a lot of it, and as they use their abilities, it dissipates. Works very similar to mana in most RPGs that are fantasy-based. So with that, you could pretty much extrapolate how it actually works. But if you're unsure of it, it's, like I said, it's a full bar. You just use your abilities, it dissipates, and it is constantly regenerating. You can get to a point where you need more of it, and you have certain abilities that can give you more, but the advanced class like the Shadow and the Assassin will be using more of it, be closer to empty more of the time than, say, the Sorcerer or the Sage. Sorcerer or the Sage will have more force to use, so it'll feel more like your typical caster in a fantasy RPG. And then you have energy. Energy is what agents and smugglers use. It is actually incredibly similar, if not almost exactly the same as heat, right? Or ammo even. So you have a full bar, you use your energy regenerates, right? So you're constantly using your energy as you're going, but it's constantly regenerating. It's regenerating very quickly. What you need to understand, though, is as you're using your energy, once you get below those certain thresholds, it takes longer and longer to regenerate. So it takes more skill to have it at a balanced point of, say, a quarter or more that you're actually ever using. And lastly is Rage and Focus. So Rage is what warriors use, Focus is what knights use. It's basically an empty bar as you use certain things that generate Rage or Focus. or if you just normally attack a enemy without actually using an ability, you'll gain your rage, and once you have that, you can spend it on certain abilities. It's fairly easy to max out your bar very quickly, so you just want to constantly be spending it as you have it on certain abilities, saving up for other more powerful ones, and creating a rotation with it. It's one of the more easy resources to manage. In fact, I feel like it's the easiest in the game, but that's my personal opinion. Some people feel that force and energy are much easier to handle. But for the most part, it's fairly common opinion to think that heat and ammo are the hardest to manage. Overall, though, rage and focus work just like rage does in World of Warcraft with warriors, except in Warcraft you have auto attacks that are constantly generating rage. In Star Wars, you have to actually generate it yourself with your normal attack that you get right off the start when you create your character. But as I said, this is just a basic rundown of the resource mechanics, and when we do advanced guides later on for the different classes, I'll be going over kind of how to manage those resources a lot better. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to them as quickly as I can, or maybe one of our community members will help answer. But on that note, we shall see you guys next time.